Good morning. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In here, we want to tell you about our paper. The title is Hierarchical and K-Means Method for Analyzing the Indonesian Welfare Indicator in the year 2020. And here it is. Let me introduce our team. Alya Salsabila, Berlianada Paweninggalih, Putri Ayu Pramesti, Isnada Slamet, and Kiki Ferawati. We are from Department of Statistics, Sebelas Maret University. First, there is introduction of this paper. The problem of social welfare is one of the problems commonly faced by developing countries, especially Indonesia. The problem is very important in the development of a country's human resource, and there is no regional grouping based on welfare. So that in terms of making policies regarding people's welfare problem, it is difficult to take and decide. One of the information that can facilitate the making of these policies is with the level of welfare of the people of a region. This is not easy and simple to do because there are several indicators that can affect the level of people's welfare. One method that can be applied in this problem is the clustering method. It is one of the statistical analyses that can be used in grouping an object based on the similarity of characteristics between the object. This study aims to obtain the result of cluster form by hierarchical and K-means methods for analyzing the Indonesian welfare indicator in the year 2020. Second is literature review. The clustering methods consist of hierarchical clustering and non-hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering consists of four methods, namely single linkage, complete linkage, average linkage, and worst linkage. And then non-hierarchical clustering consists of K-means. Single linkage. Single linkage is an agglomerative grouping procedure based on the minimum or closest distance between objects. The single linkage grouping procedure initially selects the smallest distance in D equal dig and combines the corresponding objects such as and to get a cluster UV. The next step, the distance between UV and other clusters. For example, DUVW equal min DUW, DVW, where DUW distance between nearest neighbors of cluster U and W. DVW distance between nearest neighbors of cluster V and W. Complete linkage. Complete linkage is based on the maximum or farthest distance between objects. The complete linkage method algorithm begins by finding the minimum element in D equal dig, then combining the corresponding objects such as and to get a cluster UV. The next step, the distance between UV and other clusters. For example, DUVW equal max DUV, DVW, where DUW distance between the farthest neighbors of the cluster U and W. DVW distance between the farthest neighbors of the cluster V and W. Average linkage. One of the agglomerative hierarchical cluster methods is average linkage, which is a method based on the average distance between all objects in a cluster and all objects in other clusters, which can be calculated using the following equation. According to Johnson 2007, dig is distance between object I to cluster UV and object G to cluster W, while NUV and NW are the number of objects in the cluster UV and W respectively. And the last, words linkage. The grouping of the words linkage method into minimize the increase in the sum square of error or SSE criteria.
K-mean is a method that tries to partition data into two or more groups using the average value as the center of the cluster. K-mean is commonly used in the data mining. Silhouette coefficient. In evaluating the result of grouping, what will be done is cluster validation. Cluster validation is useful for measuring the level of goodness of the cluster that is formed. One of the internal validation indexes is the silhouette coefficient. And then people welfare, according to the law number 11 of 2009, social welfare is condition in which the material, spiritual, and social needs of citizens are fulfilled, so that citizens can live properly and are able to develop themselves so that they can carry out their social functions. And then we move on to the methods. Data source. In this study, the data used are secondary data obtained from the official website Badan Pusat Statistik atau BPS regarding indicators that affect the People's Welfare Index in Indonesia in 2020. Research variable. The following variables are used. First variable is AHH or angka harapan hidup. Second variable is RRLS or rata-rata lama sekolah. Third variable is PPM or persentase penduduk miskin. Next variable is TPT or tingkat pengangguran terbuka. The analyze step that we use. First, collect secondary data obtained from the official website of BPS Indonesia. Second, perform descriptive analysis on the data. Third, perform data preprocessing. And then conducting cluster analysis or hierarchical clustering and non-hierarchical clustering. After that, draw a conclusion. Okay, and then we move on to the discussion. This is descriptive statistic of people welfare 2020 with 4 variables. After doing descriptive statistic, then the data will be processed. Next step is data preprocessing. Before proceeding to cluster analysis, data processing is done first. The initial step taken was checking for missing values, which later found that the data did not contain missing value. Then check for outlier or outliers in the data. The table shows that RRLS and PPM variable have outliers. After knowing the number and value of outliers, these outliers are maintained so as not to reduce information from the data. Next step is determine the number of clusters. This study uses the silhouette method to determine the optimal number of clusters. Based on figure 2, it can be seen that the optimal cluster form is 2 clusters. This is hierarchical clustering analysis. After selecting the number of clusters, then the cluster analysis will be carried out using the hierarchical method. Agglomerative hierarchical analysis method has 4 methods, namely single, complete, average, and words linkage. The people's welfare indicator data will be grouped into 2 clusters, or K equal 2, for each method. Best model determination. To determine the best hierarchical method, it can be seen from the value of the cooperative correlation coefficient. Based on the table, it can be seen that the hierarchical method with a cooperative correlation coefficient value close to 1 is the average linkage method, so that the best method that will be used in conducting hierarchical clustering analysis on the Indonesian people's welfare indicator in 2020 is the average linkage.
Result of hierarchical cluster analysis using the average linkage method, and there is the picture dendrogram of membership distribution of its cluster hierarchical method with average linkage. Based on figure, it is known that cluster 1 has members of 4 provinces and cluster 2 has members of 30 provinces. And there is cluster 1, member of cluster there are Nusa Tenggara Timur, Maluku, Papua Barat, Papua. And cluster 2, member of cluster there are Aceh, Sumatera Utara, Sumatera Barat, Riau, Jambi, Sumatera Selatan, Bengkulu, Lampung, Kepulauan Bangka Belitung, Kepulauan Riau, DKI Jakarta, Jawa Barat, Jawa Tengah, DI Yogyakarta, Jawa Timur, Banten, Bali, Nusa Tenggara Barat, Kalimantan Barat, Kalimantan Tengah, Kalimantan Selatan, Kalimantan Timur, Kalimantan Utara, Sulawesi Utara, Sulawesi Tengah, Sulawesi Selatan, Sulawesi Tenggara, Gorontalo, Sulawesi Barat, and Maluku Utara. The description of the grouping result is done by looking at the average of its indicator in its cluster that is formed. The following is the average of each indicator using the average linkage method, like this table below. Based on the result from table, the average value of the AHH and RRLS indicator in the second cluster is higher than the first cluster and Indonesia. Then, the value of TPT indicator in the second cluster is lower than the first cluster and Indonesia. The greater the AHH and the RRLS indicator, and the lower the TPT indicator means the higher the level of welfare of a region. Meanwhile, the average value of the PPM indicator in the first cluster is higher than the second cluster and Indonesia. This means that the higher the PPM indicator, the lower the level of welfare of a region. So, it can be concluded that the second cluster has a high level of welfare and the first cluster has a low level of welfare. Non-hierarchical cluster analysis with k-means. The following is the membership of each cluster formed by the k-means method, and there is the picture member of each cluster with the k-mean methods. Based on figure, the members of each cluster are obtained. Cluster 1 consists of 12 provinces and cluster 2 consists of 22 provinces in Indonesia. Cluster 1, member of cluster there are Aceh, Sumatera Selatan, Bengkulu, Lampung, Nusa Tenggara Barat, Nusa Tenggara Timur, Sulawesi Tengah, Gorontalo, Sulawesi Barat, Maluku, Papua Barat, and Papua. Cluster 2, member of cluster there are Sumatera Utara, Sumatera Barat, Riau, Jambi, Kepulauan Bangka Belitung, Kepulauan Riau, DKI Jakarta, Jawa Barat, Jawa Tengah, DI Yogyakarta, Jawa Timur, Banten, Nusa Tenggara Timur, Kalimantan Barat, Kalimantan Tengah, Kalimantan Selatan, Kalimantan Timur, Kalimantan Utara, Sulawesi Selatan, Sulawesi Tenggara, and Maluku Utara. And then k-means method. The description of the grouping result is done by looking at the average of each indicator in its cluster that is formed. The following is the average of each indicator using the k-means method, like the table below. Similar to the result of the hierarchical analysis method with average linkage, the analysis using the k-means method result in the second cluster having a high level of the welfare and the first cluster having a low level of welfare. It can be seen from the table. The average value of the AHH and RRLS indicator in the second cluster is higher than the first cluster in Indonesia. Furthermore, the value of the TPT indicator in the second cluster is lower than the first cluster in Indonesia. The greater the AHH and RRLS indicators, and the lower the TPT indicator means the higher the level of the welfare of a region. Meanwhile, the average value of the PPM indicator in the first cluster is higher than the second cluster in Indonesia. This means that the higher the PPM indicator, the lower the level of welfare of a region. And then next, the conclusion. And here it is the conclusion. Average linkage. Cluster analysis using the average linkage method resulted in two clusters where the member of the cluster 1 consists of 4 provinces. And then the member of cluster 2 consists of 30 provinces in Indonesia. Judging from the average of each indicator of AHH, RLS, PPM, and TPT, it is found that cluster 1 is included in the low cluster and cluster 2 is included in the high cluster. K-means. Using the K-mean methods, cluster analysis resulted in two clusters, where the cluster 1 members consist of 12 provinces, member of cluster 2 consists of 22 provinces in Indonesia. Judging from the average of each indicator of AHH, RLS, PPM, and TPT, it is found that cluster 1 is included in the low cluster and cluster 2 is included in the high cluster. And there are some references that we use for our paper. Thank you for your listening. May all those we have shared be beneficial for all of us. And thank you so much for your attention.